Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris, I'm Kellen. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for having us today.
Thanks for coming out. Love having you.
So we're at the Hunley Center. What's the Hunley?
The Hunley is the first successful combat submarine in history. It was in the Civil War, and it brought down a Union ship, so that's its claim to fame.
Now, is this the Hunley behind us?
This is not the Hunley. Let's be perfectly clear. This is a replica of what was before the Hunley.
So a lot of what you guys do here is to tell the story of submarine warfare during the Civil War and how that all relates to the Hunley.
Right. The Hunley started at submarine warfare. So but there's also a big mystery surrounding the Hunley is she never came back. So she did her mission, and then she was never heard from again.
So tell me a little bit about the Hunley's mission.
So the Hunley was used to basically break the blockade that was surrounding Charleston's harbor. And they went out, successfully did their mission, and they signaled that they were coming back, and then they just never came back. And then in '95, Clive Cussler's dive team actually found the Hunley, and then it took about 5 years for them to figure out how to raise that from the ocean floor.
So then the question becomes, what do we do with this big submarine?
Right, what do you do with it? And also it had a crew of 8 people on there, so we wanted to make sure the bodies were handled with dignity. There was a full burial for them. And then just getting inside the submarine, getting all the artifacts out, and then taking care of it and conserving it for future display.
Now, how did the Hunley get its name?
It is from one of the financiers, Horace Lawson Hunley. That's why it's called H.L. Hunley. And he actually perished on part of the second crew.
So as we explore the Hunley Center, tell me a little bit about what it is you do here.
So we like to showcase different aspects of the project. It's very historical, and it's also very scientific.
I understand we're going to get to see some of that today.
You are, and you're going to get to actually meet one of our archaeologists, and he's going to take you through the lab and everything.
We've also got a museum. We've got the Hunley itself.
We've got different exhibits, interactive exhibits. You can get into a Hunley and actually crank to see what it would be like, so that's fun to do.
I can't wait.
Have a great time.
Thank you. This way to begin the Hunley journey. I hope this has a better ending for me than it did for the Hunley crew. This lantern over here is similar to the one that the Hunley crew was supposed to use to signal to shore that they had accomplished their mission. We see the Union is dissolved, of course, Charleston being the hotbed center of secession. Some items that folks had used as they were gearing up and getting ready for their time in service. This museum's fantastic. If we look over here, we can see models of the Hunley and what it was like to be crammed inside of that small metal tube. Over here, we've got a movie prop that shows you what it was like, and we could sit right inside and turn the crank. But rather than sit in the movie prop, we're gonna go into an actual reproduction in just a second. As we walk over here, we can see all sorts of works in progress, aspects of the sub, what the Housatonic looked like, and then inside, we can go into the Hunley itself. Or near about. So if I'm in the Hunley, I'm in a tiny little metal tube cranking this thing to keep it moving. And me and my shipmates are all lined up next to each other, trying to crank in unison. Now imagine what this is like on my hands. Imagine what this is like on my back. Imagine what this is like if my deodorant's not working. It's terrible. Of course, I can stand up here. Those guys would not have been able to stand up inside the Hunley. They'd have had to crouch to get inside and get out. If we walk over here into this actual reproduction, we're really going to see what it was like to be inside one of those iron lungs of submarines. Listen to the sound as we're revving the engine. See, I gotta use leverage. This is terrible. No wonder it took 7 of them to crank this thing. They're under here for 2 hours trying to keep this thing moving, trying to breathe this stuffy air. Claustrophobic. I've got nice plexiglass here, but they didn't have at the time. I've got light coming through that they didn't have at the time. Now, as I sit and experience this, I think this is a death trap, but these men felt that they were on a mission headed toward destiny. Now, how would I measure up if I was a member of the Hunley myself? If we go over here to look at this exhibit, we can see the heights of the crewmen. I'm 6'1", so I'm a little taller than this fella, a little shorter than this fella. I think I'm gonna measure up right about here. But at 6 feet tall, remember, I still have to be crunched over and cranking, and how physically uncomfortable that's gonna be the entire time. Now, it's time for us to go see the Hunley itself, and we have someone waiting to show us. Let's go take a look. Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, I'm Nick DeLong. I'm one of the maritime archaeologists here.
Tell me about some of the archaeological work you've been doing.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is Lieutenant Dixon and some of his personal artifacts. So some of what we're looking at here are his suspenders, buttons, he has his binoculars, his pocket knife, and what that can tell us about who he was as an individual. For instance, his suspender buckles are engraved silver with his initials. So they're kind of fancy for the time, and it's engraved with his initials, so he kind of likes that stuff and about him and things like that. So that's what we've been working on a lot right now, is looking at personal artifacts and what they can tell us about the crew.
And he was wearing a different sort of clothing than some of the folks that were on there. That tells you something different about him too, right?
Absolutely. So some of his clothing survived really, really well in terms of preservation, especially compared to other crew members. And what we've actually been able to determine is that he was wearing all cashmere. So he had a cashmere jacket as well as cashmere pants and suede boots. So, he's obviously a man of means. He cares about his stature. So yeah, that tells us a lot about who he was as an individual and how he probably felt about that night and going into battle.
I can imagine he felt hot being in a little metal tube.
I imagine it was quite warm. However, he was one of the only crew members who wasn't operating the crank. So in some ways he has, a less demanding job, at least physically.
Lieutenant Dixon has one of the more famous individual stories here because of a gold coin. Tell us about that.
Correct. So the famous story about Dixon and his gold coin was that he was shot and wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. And he survived because he had a gold coin in his pocket that took the brunt of the shot. And after that, he kept that gold coin as a good luck charm. And that was always in the historical record until we were excavating the Hunley and actually found that gold coin, dented, engraved, right there in his pocket. So it, told us exactly what happened.
It wasn't just a myth, it was reality.
It was real.
So can we see the Hunley itself?
Absolutely, right this way.
This is absolutely incredible. I mean, look how well you can see this.
It's pretty amazing, and we try to do a pretty good job of keeping this as clear as possible for the public to enjoy this, because that's really what it's about. It's about public engagement, getting people interested in the Hunley, and making sure people have the ability to appreciate it.
Now, I understand, though, we're behind this glass panel because that's not just water it's sitting in.
That is not just water it's sitting in. That is actually a solution of 1% sodium hydroxide. And the purpose of that sodium hydroxide is to actually help pull out the salts and chlorides that the metal kind of accumulated over time sitting at the ocean floor. So
I remember the first time I saw the sub, it still had a lot of crust on it, and these baths help kind of get all that off.
Yes. So one of the first steps in the conservation of the sub itself was actually to deconcrete the submarine. So there is a layer of concretion, which is just an organic layer on top of the iron that has to be physically removed. And then we inserted the solution to help pull out those salts and chlorides.
So as I'm looking at the sub, where's the front, where's the back? Tell me how this works.
Absolutely. So to our left, we have the front or the bow, and then to the right, we have the stern, and then the port side, which is facing us, and starboard on the opposite side.
And what are the holes that we see on the top of the sub?
So as you can tell, we've actually removed some plates from the hull of the submarine, and that was so we could actually get in there and excavate the interior of the submarine, which was packed full of mud and sediment. So we had to actually excavate the interior of the submarine, much like you would do any other archaeological site.
Now, as I look inside, I can see the hand cranks that I got to use in the demonstration in the museum. It looks like it was really cramped in there.
Very, very cramped. Not a lot of wiggle room. You're right up next to everybody else. So yes, it's very cramped. It's only, 3.5 feet tall. It's very cramped. It's dark, very rough operating, so it would be tough to work in there.
How did they see?
Well, they had one single candle, and we actually were able to excavate and recover that candle from inside the submarine. So that was kind of their one source of light inside the submarine.
Now I think about the smoke coming off a candle, making the air in there smoky. Couldn't have been easy to breathe in the first place. How did they breathe down there?
No, so the air that they had when they went down that was it. The air they take with them is all that they have. So there was no filtration system necessarily, not like today. So what they had with them when they started is all that they had. Now they did have 2 snorkels, so 2 snorkel tubes that they could actually raise. They sat right behind the forward conning tower, and from inside the submarine they could raise those. They're about 4 feet long. They could make them vertical, and then they could pump fresh air in and push kind of what they called fouled air out. Now from the historical record, it looks like they didn't end up using that very much, and instead they would typically just kind of come to the surface, crack the hatches, refresh the system, get a breath of fresh air, and then go back to operations.
Now, did they have a periscope that let them see if it was safe?
No periscope. The closest thing they had to a periscope is actually the conning towers. So what they would do is they would raise to the point where just the conning towers kind of broke the surface. And there were 2 portholes on the front of that forward conning tower that the captain, or Dixon in this case, could look out of to navigate.
I can just imagine poking your head up into that hole, go left, go right, go starboard.
Yeah.
Like that must have been a very complicated way to navigate.
Very complicated. They typically use what we call dead reckoning, which is where you kind of visualize, you see what you need to go to and head towards it. So they also had a compass on board, but we don't know exactly how well it would have worked. So they had navigation tools with them, but we think that for the most part, they used what we call dead reckoning.
Now, as they cranked that hand crank when they were underway, how fast could that thing go?
So we've been able to determine that it had a cruising speed of about 1 to 1.5 knots, so just over a mile an hour, and a sprinting speed of about 4 to 5 knots. So not very fast.
When you say sprinting speed, I'm thinking of these guys.
Absolutely. So very short bursts, as fast as they can go, and still only getting up to about 4, maybe 5 knots.
Now, after they successfully completed their mission, they were supposed to flash a lamp to folks on shore. How would they do that?
So they had with them what we call the blue light. So it was a lantern with a blue filter on it. And the idea was once they successfully attacked and sank the USS Housatonic and they were making their way back, they would raise that lantern to signal the crew on shore that would then light a big bonfire to help them navigate back. Because, unlike today, the shoreline would be pitch black during that time period, making navigation very difficult.
So they show the light goes out, and nobody hears from them again. That's where the mystery begins.
Yes. So originally in the historical record, we thought that they did have the opportunity to actually raise that blue light because the crew set the fire. Now, what we've actually been able to determine is it's unlikely that the Hunley, based off of its position when it was located, which is actually further out to sea past the Housatonic, the light that the crew from the beach was actually seeing was likely a flare from the USS Housatonic that would have looked blue off of the water.
The mystery deepens.
Exactly.
So the Hunley then sinks, and all the crewmen are aboard. They're still there when you find the sub years later.
Correct. So when we brought the Hunley here to the lab to begin excavations, one of the first and primary goals was to focus on the crew inside because this is a war grave. So we wanted to pay special attention to that, to respect those that served on board the submarine.
So you've also been able to find other artifacts as part of that excavation. You had the chance to show some to us a few minutes ago, but you've got more to show.
We have more to show you. Yeah, we have a little bit more around Dixon. We'll show you the process of how we actually conserve and excavate those textile materials, that really fragile fabric.
So I'm getting to go behind the scenes into the lab. This is going to be exciting.
Absolutely. We'll go right there.
So here we get to see you do some archaeological science.
Absolutely. So what we have here, this is what we call block lift excavation. So a block lift is essentially a section of sediment recovered from the interior of the submarine that holds textiles. So very, very fragile clothing, cloth, things like that. And because the tight quarters inside the sub, which you already saw, and these are so fragile, it was safer to actually bring them out in as big of a chunk as we could and then do a much more controlled excavation here in the lab. So we have here kind of our three-step process in how this kind of works. So we have the original block lift, and this is kind of after it gets uncovered and spread out, still soaking in water, and then the final product there, what we hope to kind of get.
So when you bring that out of the sub, do you necessarily know what's in that block?
We do not know what's in that block necessarily. One of the first things that we do, though, is x-ray that to see if there are any diagnostic artifacts within that block lift that we need to be aware of before we start working on it.
And then you bring it in here into this super scientific dihydrogen oxide.
Right. Fancy, fancy water. Yes, so we want to keep our artifacts soaked in water to keep them from drying out, which is one of the biggest enemies in terms of preservation. So we keep them soaking, and that's actually why we keep them in the water when we're excavating as well. It helps, maintain preservation, but it also helps with the structure of the textile itself. They're so fragile that the water actually helps keep them together.
Now, wait till you see this. He showed me his super scientific archaeological underwater tools. What do you have?
So what we have here is we use a syringe to actually kind of blow some of the sediment out in a very controlled manner, and then a small spatula. Well, a lot of the tools that we use in this phase are almost like dental tools because this stuff is so fragile.
And as you work at this, this obviously takes patience and a very calm, steady hand. How long does it take to uncover this?
So, like you said, this is a very slow-going process. So a block lift of this size could take upwards of 2 weeks, depending on what we find inside. So, for instance, if the textile within this block lift is very intact, one of the things that we're going to have to do after that is kind of unravel it and then clean that as well. So that's going to make it a little bit longer. As you can see here, this is from one of the crew members. His name was Miller, or at least tentatively known as Miller. And this is a vest. So this is a section of the vest that he was wearing the night of the attack. Is one of the front panels. And as you can see here, it still has remnants of some of the sediment, as well as the staining. You notice that red staining along that? That's actually from the corrosion product from the iron.
Oh. But it's fascinating because I can still see the checkers and the material.
Yep, that window pane checkered pattern is still intact, again giving us a little bit better understanding of the quality of this garment. So this is wool, fairly high quality, not the fanciest, not quite up there with Dixon in terms of cashmere, but still a very nice civilian style vest from that time period.
Now, all the artifacts you showed us earlier have had to go through this same sort of process, correct?
Yes. So they all go through a very methodical conservation process before they get to go on display, which is what you saw out there.
Wow. So by the time we get to this final panel, it's gone through many processes, a lot of hours of very patient, meticulous care. What are you going to finally do with a final product like this?
Well, eventually the idea is that this stuff will go on display, so that people can kind of appreciate it and learn about these people as individuals, the ones who operated, the crew members on the submarine, to help tell their story, because this is an important part of who they were.
You told me earlier that as you uncover these artifacts and you get to know some of these men a little bit, it really personalizes this story for you.
Absolutely. It gives us a much better understanding of them as people, not just historical figures, but their everyday, the things that they found important. The submarine is so small that any artifact that we find inside the submarine had to have served some sort of purpose, whether it be personal or part of the operations of the submarine. So whatever they brought with them had to have served, at least very personal to them as individuals. So again, telling us the story about the crew.
Nick, this has been wonderful and fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely.
Talking with Nick about the work he's been doing reminds me that these men weren't just wax figures or anonymous names. They were people just like you and me. And that's why it's so important to continue to explore history the way we are.